you were to talk about the greatest Olympians of all time in terms of medals won at a single Olympics, you're talking the likes of Michael Phelps, you're talking Mark Spitz, Matt Biondi. Here in Australia, the great Emma McKeon. But one name you often don't hear mentioned in that sentence is an athlete by the name of George Eyser, an American gymnast who in 1904 not only won 6 Olympic medals at one Olympics, he won them in a day. 6 Olympic medals in one day, which to this day stands as a record as the most Olympic medals won in a single day. And what was even more unique about George is that he did this with a wooden leg in the sport of gymnastics. And not a lot is known about George and his stories. Pardon for a few little quirky facts on one of these random Olympic facts podcasts or videos that you do see, until a recent article by an esteemed author shed a little bit of light on the career and times of the great George Eyser. I'm joined today by Joshua Prager, who, an esteemed author, as I said, author of 3 books. He's a Pulitzer Prize nominated author, former senior writer for the Wall Street Journal. And his article that was penned a few months ago gets into so much detail about George that we had to get him on the show. We had to learn more about this great athlete and learn more about the story behind writing this article. First of all, Joshua, welcome to Off The Podium. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about George.
I am excited to learn about George because this is an athlete that nobody talks about that should be. Because as you and I were just talking a bit about off air, kind of pops up every now and then in one of these sort of random factoids. There was a book I read recently, Total Olympics, which have got a couple of pages on him. The IOC have released things on him, but not a lot is known about him. So I'd first of all like to ask, what brought about you kind of going into more details about George? Was it a case of you were sick of reading a little fact about him and you wanted to learn more about this champion of the Olympics?
It was actually when Oscar Pistorius, the runner from South Africa, who they called the Blade Runner, who had, a double amputee, when he was in the Olympics, all of the different newspapers sort of trotted out the same paragraph saying, he's not actually the first amputee in the Olympics. Many, many, many years ago, obviously excluding the Paralympics. Many years ago, there was a man named George Eyser who in 1904 won all of these medals on a wooden leg. And I said, oh, wow, I'd like to learn more about him. I think the reason I was so interested is I love sports. That's number one, love the Olympics, but also I have a disability. 34 years ago, I was in a bus accident and I had a spinal cord injury and I walk with a cane. So to read about a great disabled athlete, I was excited to learn more about him. And then I went online, and as you just sort of noted, there was very little about the man. It was bizarre. His life, his death was unknown, how he became disabled, all of these things. In fact, very little was known about him, save for the fact that he had this one sort of miraculous day in 1904. So I decided, you know what, I'm just going to kind of little by little by little over the course of the next many years, try to put his life together. And that is what I did. It took me 12 years and I was able to uncover most of what I was looking for. Not everything, but most.
12 years. That is insane. I can't say I've ever committed to something for 12 years, Joshua. So that is absolutely extraordinary. Where do you even begin? Where do you even begin to try and unpack the story of George when you decide to set out on this journey?
Well, even just to find out, I guess my very first quest was the one that actually was unresolved. It was, how did this man lose most of his left leg, or about half of his left leg? And what I read was that it was lost in a train accident. But to tell you I was comprehensive in my searches, putting it quite mildly, I found out where he lived. I followed his life from sort of Germany to Denver, to St. Louis, to Dayton, to California, and back to Denver, and really looked at all of the different sort of records of train accidents and all of the different, reached out to railroads and aficionados and everything. And he was not injured in a train accident. And in fact, I even found something very thrilling. He was part of many different groups that were called Turnverein. These were sort of German athletic organizations that were also sort of hubs of sort of social and political activity. But the founder stressed gymnastics. They started in Germany in the early 19th century. And I found one of the original logbooks from Denver in one of these groups that George was a member of. And it covered the time span when George was injured. It says when he leaves the club, when he comes back. It doesn't say sort of how he was injured. My best guess is that it happened at work. He worked for a man. He had many different jobs, but one of them was doing sort of working for someone with a gas fitter. And there were a lot of explosions. I think this could have happened to him. He could have lost that leg in an explosion. The other possibility is I go into, although George is known for a physical disability, it's really mental illness that most defines his family's life. And he was living for a time with a man, an uncle, who was mentally ill, who was institutionalized for a time, and who was also quite dangerous. And he was let out of the hospital and moved back in with George during a time when other people described him as sort of wild. And so these are the sort of two best guesses that I could come up with as to how George lost his leg.
Which that must be researching this article and researching everything you do. Was that the biggest achievement in a way that you kind of found to kind of debunk this myth that he lost it in a train, and that you can sort of, I guess, pinpoint that this did come from somewhere else?
I think it was actually two other things. The first thing, what really motivated me, was it bothered me. You mentioned that I worked at the Wall Street Journal, and I did. And in 2011, so just before I started looking into this, there was an article about the 1904 games. And they really were sullied. They were sort of put down. History has not looked favorably upon those games for various reasons, including the fact that the founder of the IOC was upset that the 1904 games were moved from Chicago to St. Louis. And he really, later in a 1931 memoir, he puts down the games. And towards that end, someone who was quoted in the article, a sports historian, he says, how good could the games have been? After all, a disabled man won all of these medals. And that really irked me. And it turns out to be nonsense. George was a dominant gymnast of his time, as I make abundantly clear. He won event after event after event, after the nation's best, and then the world's best. He travels to Germany at one point, does well there as well. So that was the first thing, to kind of restore legitimacy to this man's achievements. And then the second thing was, people literally did not know how he died, where he lived, and then how he died. And I discovered the sort of tragic fact of his suicide, that in 1919, 1 month, less than a year after he writes his will in 1918, he dies by suicide. He shoots himself at the home where he lived with his sister. And he's buried today in an unmarked grave. We don't even know exactly where he is. So those were the two things that I think were most important to me.
I'd like to just give us a brief, touching on a few of his achievements, but let's go back to the beginning with George. Tell us a little bit about sort of where he came from, what brought him to the US, and sort of this journey that began through gymnastics.
Yeah, so he's born in 1870 in Germany. And while his mother is pregnant with him, his father is sent to the institution I mentioned. And so he's then born into a family that is already broken. He has an older sister. And soon thereafter, the mother dies. And so he and his sister are orphans. They are foster children. And they come to this country, to America, I should say, when he's 14 years old. And they go to move in with an uncle and an aunt. They're not married. They're brother and sister, who were also German born. And they live with them in Denver. Denver was home to a very large German community, German schools, these Turnverein I mentioned, these gymnastics organizations, and German newspapers, et cetera. And that's where he's sort of growing up. One of the other things that was sort of put out there that was incorrect about George is that it was only after his injury, this supposed train accident, which most people thought occurred back in Germany, it was only after that injury that he then got into gymnastics. But actually, it's not true. I found that just before his injury, and I was able to find out when the injury happened, 1891. So in 1890, when he's 20 years old, he actually competes for the first time in one of these big Turner events. He does pretty well. He's in the top 10. And he he takes to it. And then the sort of most exciting thing for me that I found, I was like, well, at least when did this happen? And I had reached out to a guy named Robert Graber. Robert Graber was actually one of George's contemporaries, one of the great gymnasts who went head to head with George all of those years in Denver. And his grandson, who was himself a very old man in his late 80s, just to give you a sense of how long ago this happened, I reached out to him and he said, you know what? I inherited a trunk of the paper records of my grandfather's career. Let me go through that trunk. And he dies less than a month after he looks this up for me. But he found this beautiful thing, which was, I can show you here, an old magazine called Western Athletics Magazine. And what was so exciting, and Robert's grandson was so happy that he found this for me. It was from July 1895. And on the inside the magazine, I'll show you here, there is this beautiful picture of George. There he is. And I had to speak to various members of the Olympic Committee to properly describe the moves that he was doing. But I'll just read to you what it says here, this great photo caption that said more than anyone else had ever known about George Eyser. It says, a splendid illustration of what the Turner system of physical training can do for one under adverse circumstances. Mr. Eyser was confined to a sick room for many months, from 1891 to 1893, walking on crutches when able to be about, and finally having his left foot amputated just above the ankle. For 2 years past, he has taken Turner training and has not only a thoroughly developed muscular system, but performs many acts upon horizontal and parallel bars that would puzzle Turners, possessing all members and muscles in perfect condition. So this great thing kind of gave me a sense of who this man was. And I was like, all right, I'm off and running. Now I'm starting to put this man's life together. And it just sort of little by little cobbled the rest of it together, looking in, like censuses and city directories and auction records and burial records and patient and probate files and newspaper archives and all of these different things where there would be these little breadcrumbs, these wonderful mentions of George.
What an incredible story. And I love hearing articles like the style of writing, back then, right? Like it's so whimsical and so just like vivid, isn't it? That you kind of lost there. But that's the beauty of being a journalist and an author, right? It's the breadcrumbs you mentioned. You get a couple of things and it leads you down on a path, because the one thing that I really got from the article and is that, and you've obviously alluded to, not a lot is known about him, so there's not a whole lot of connections. Like you sort of say at the very end of the article about how it's not like he's got a great grandson or a daughter or like family, like that sort of level of it. So when you're able to find like the grandson of a person who can, that must be just like an Olympic gold medal to you right there, that you've kind of hit the jackpot.
It was very exciting. And speaking of the Olympic gold medals, he bequeaths the 6 medals that he won on that single day, 3 golds, 2 silvers, and a bronze, to his sister, and who outlives him and then moves to California. And I found 2 of the medals, looking at old auction records. They had turned up at an old thrift shop in California.
Wow.
And then went from person to person to person. And a woman named Ingrid O'Neill, who was one of the she runs one of these big auction houses that works with pedals and Olympic stuff, had auctioned off 2 of his medals. So we actually know where 2 of the 6 are. The thing that if any of your listeners find, I would be like utterly thrilled and go bonkers for, is in his will. He even named it a careful scrapbook that he had kept for many, many years. And you know what? Like, I've been doing this long enough that I know somewhere in someone's attic or in someone's garage, there is this scrapbook. And that would be really thrilling to no doubt sort of fill in the missing pieces of his life. But you're right, he had no living descendants. He never married. He had no children. His sister had no children. He only had one set of very distant relatives in Denmark, and they had never heard of this man.
Wow.
So there you go. It's just nice, though, as we discuss the Olympics, and obviously you and your listeners care about this, to restore a man to his proper place. And that's really what I tried to do.
Because it's one of these ones that I feel, and you kind of summed it up very well there when you said in that article where it was, almost dismissive of the fact that a man on a wooden leg won 6 medals. But, in a day and age where we are celebrating things like the Paralympics a whole lot more. They're almost equal weight to the Olympics in terms of the coverage and the attention they get, which is very long overdue. That this is something that Phil should be celebrated more. That this is a guy who achieved the most extraordinary things, and the fact that, again, to this day, 6 Olympic medals in a single day. I mean, that's just insane. That's more than some countries have won in their entire, like more than Fiji. I'm not here to shit all on Fiji, but it's a random country I can pull out of knowing that that's true. So, I mean, this is something that it just baffles me that he's kind of almost like glossed over in the history books.
Absolutely. And one of the things that bothered me also was, I mentioned, I don't know how you pronounce his name, Coubertin, the head of the IOC, who really kind of was dismissive of the 1904 games and said how, well, all of the, 2/3 of the athletes who were there were from the host country of the United States. Well, I made clear in the article that was the same of the sort of previous 2 Olympics as well. It's not fair to sort of focus on this game. But yeah, he really did. He rose to the moment. And in fact, what's very sad, I didn't know this. I'm American. I should have known this. But just like Japanese Americans were sort of discriminated against horribly during World War II, that I did know. But German Americans were discriminated against horribly, and really not just discriminated against, injured. And one man actually was murdered. A person who very bizarrely had my last name. We are not related, Prager. They underwent intense discrimination during World War I because, of course, the United States was at war with Germany. And you see at the end of his life, Eyser, he goes back to Denver from California to be with his sister, to sort of, huddle close. And he stops competing in the German-American Turner halls because they sort of want to push, distance themselves from this German identity. But what made me think of that just now, like what an athlete he was, late in his life, in his 40s, he actually competes in one more big event in California, and he wins that too. So he was really like the dominant gymnast of those many, many years. And, he wins the parallel bars, the horse vault, the pommel horse, the horizontal bar, and the rope climb. Some of those were silver and bronze, but he medaled in all of them. The rope climb was the only one we obviously don't have today, and was the only one, incidentally, where I can imagine that his disability might have even been of benefit to him because there would have been less weight to sort of pull up. But all of the other ones, it's kind of remarkable, like dismounting off the vault onto one leg and a prosthetic. It's really quite something.
I was very fascinated reading that because, I was, picturing sort of, maybe these are the events he's winning because it's all upper body. But as you say, like kind of to have that. And the unique thing, I mean, look, we're planning on doing episodes in the future, Joshua, on old Olympic Games. And I feel our St. Louis episode will go for multiple hours. But I think the unique thing of that Games is the fact that he competed, a couple of months prior to him winning those medals in one day, and which was essentially a triathlon mixed with gymnastics, essentially. I mean, is that how you describe it? Because he had to do gymnastics events and then he had to basically go and run. Like, I mean...
He had to do track and field. It's crazy. Yes. The games coincided. And the reason they landed in St. Louis because they wanted to sort of piggyback the popularity of the World's Fair. So they were actually moved from Chicago to St. Louis to be there as well. And by the way, another thing that is often sort of leveled at the 1904 games is that they were sort of responsible for this very racist competition. It was called the Anthropology Days. And those were horrible, where they sort of pitted indigenous peoples against each other in all of these ridiculous competitions. But that actually was hosted by the World's Fair, not the Olympics, just as an aside. But anyway, yes, so because the World's Fair lasted so many months, they actually had these 2 very large gymnastics competition months apart. And George participated in the first one as well. But as you say, it's sort of crazy. They're basically part and parcel of a track and field event. And what might be to me the single most remarkable thing about George Eyser, he does compete in those track and field events and actually does okay. Like he might have finished last in the whatever it was, 100-meter run, but it's only 5 seconds off the lead. It's sort of remarkable that this man with this lower wooden leg is even running 100-meter dashes at all.
If any of us could get within 5 seconds of Usain Bolt in 100 meters, we'd be celebrating that, right?
Exactly. And what's kind of cool is you see, I mentioned how he didn't marry and he didn't have children. These turners, these turn variety, they were his whole life. He was part of fundraising groups and part of sort of groups that raised money for the Christmas celebrations. And he was part of the masquerade balls. And you could see that he really loved this organization. And that he's not here. I wish I could talk to him more about his suicide, his frame of mind. I wish I could ask him about why he never married. Was he gay? Like, I wish I could ask him a million questions, but I can't. And so the best I could do was to sort of, put together the facts that I found and sort of present them to the reader and say, look, here is a man who is a forgotten Olympian, a forgotten Olympic hero.
Because the fascinating thing too about Olympics back then is that, a lot of the time these athletes were in a city and you could almost show up on the day and just be like, hey, I want to be an Olympic. And because majority of them didn't even know they were in the Olympics, because famously 1900, 1904 at both the World's Fairs, many of them didn't even know they were competing in the Olympics. So, I mean, George had moved to St. Louis, of course, and then obviously, that helped him in the location of it. But, I mean, can you imagine today, like, what we just had in Paris, if you were living in Paris and all of a sudden you just woke up and like, oh, it's Thursday. All right. Oh, I just want to go compete in the Olympics. Like, it's amazing to think that you could sort of do that back in the day and then obviously dominate the way that he did.
Absolutely. But I will tell you, he did know. Like, he moves to St. Louis right before the Olympic Games. That's definitely what was going on with him. And he cared deeply. You can tell, like I mentioned, how he kept this scrapbook. He also, one thing that's very interesting, his sort of chief rival during these games is a gymnast named Anton Haida. And they go head to head. And Haida ends up winning the all-around competition. He gets the gold, Eyser wins the silver. But a lot of the German-American newspapers actually call it, like, one of them dubs it the Eyser Festival, because here you have, like, a man on a wooden leg doing what he was doing. But I bring it up because Haida did something really ugly. There was a mistake. There was a slight judging mistake for one of the events that ended up giving Haida, like actually handing to Haida one of George's medals. I don't remember which one it is, but he gets the gold. He gets George's gold instead of his silver. And then he refuses to give it back and he sort of absconds with it. And I found this amazing article where George is getting ready to sue him. He's like, give me back my fucking medal. So there you go.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's really, so he cared. He cared.
Did he get it back, or did he end up still, like, what's the result?
We have no record that he gets it back. There you go. So all of us 120 years later need to be clear that Haida was the sort of, unpleasant man here.
He was a villain in this story.
But he's a villain, exactly.
Wow, that's crazy.
I didn't even mention that in the piece, but it was crazy.
I mean, I'm seeing a movie made out of this, Joshua. Like, I mean, I'm surprised there hasn't been one sort of made on that. I'll touch on that after. But so through your research and kind of what you discovered, was there much discrimination against George? Like, kind of like sort of because of his disability, or kind of was it just overlooked because he was so bloody good at what he did that people didn't really care?
It's a great question. I wondered about that a lot too. And there's this one article that is so fascinating that I found. I don't remember which event it was discussing, but it basically says that, people kind of, there was this sort of like, I don't remember what the phrase is, but they're not booing, but they're kind of saying, like, why is this man here? And then very quickly he turns that kind of, discrimination, if you will. It wasn't pity, but it was sort of like, disapproval. Why is this man even here? He very quickly, as he wins event after event, sort of turns that into loud applause. And you could see that, it wasn't like it is nowadays with ESPN here, where we all knew all of the athletes. Whenever he was in a city, he had to kind of win them over anew. It describes that he's very stolid. He's unemotional. He just sort of ignores the murmurings in the crowd. And then when he wins, he just sort of looks over to his friends with a small smile, like, I've done this before, I'm going to do it again. It's interesting, though, in a good way, the press does not sort of fixate on his disability. They mention it always. Sometimes they get it wrong, which leg he was missing. They only once is there an article that I found where someone speculates as to who his father is. and they're wrong about that too. He kept his life private. He was never the subject of a feature story. He really was very quiet. I wonder why he did that. Did he not want to talk about this? And that really does bring up, in my mind, the sort of mental illness that was the hallmark of his family, where you had, one person after another who committed suicide and was hospitalized. His father, his great uncle, his uncle he lived with, all of these different people. And then sadly, ultimately him. And I wonder if he really just wanted to keep the focus away from his family and just really focus on what he did in the gym.
This is where so many of the fascinating aspects of this story, of that history, because, we're still kind of emerging through a time right now where mental illness is talked about more, but obviously there's still a lot of more work we can still do here, and we're talking in 2024. This was obviously at a very different time when it came to mental illness. So I can't imagine that in that period of time, it was something that, was even talked about outside of, you're going to an institution, you're doing this, you're doing that. So, obviously going back to what you're saying about you'd love to go back and talk to the man and learn more about him. The times he lived in, sadly, no doubt probably accelerated the pain of that even more so than, say, if he was living today.
Yeah, you're right. The way that the various relatives sort of suffered is depicted in sort of, harsh and brutal terms in the newspapers. He's at a hearing. Basically, at one point, the uncle he lives with, the uncle's sister, George's aunt, has to take him to court, basically just to get him to have him admitted to a hospital, because he's sort of so dangerous to her. And it's not written about in the way it would be written about today. You're right.
Was there anything through your research that told you about any prospects of him going to London in 1908? Was there, did you find anything out along the lines of why there wasn't a second Olympics in George's career?
No, but there's a wonderful description of a trip he takes to Germany, where he goes with his Denver teammates to Germany for an enormous international Turner meet. And that was very exciting. We're like literally tens and tens and tens of thousands of gymnasts from around the world are competing. And one thing that was very tantalizing, it mentions there that they actually had videotape. I don't know what the technology was, but there was actually video of him and his teammates performing. I reached out to the organizing bodies of this thing. This is 120 years later, and they said, "Sorry, buddy, we don't have that." But I had this fantasy that I'd be able to sort of have video of George accompany my story.
I'm sure, again, as you're going back to the scrapbook, somebody's got it somewhere, surely.
Somewhere. I agree. You never know. Things turn up. That's the beauty. I appreciate you having me on, because now, my article appeared in a wonderful but sort of small magazine, and I'm just thrilled that the American Scholar, and it's the publication of Phi Beta Kappa here in America, and I'm thrilled that you can share the story with your audience.
Well, this is, I think, it's a story worth telling, because I know, like, as I sort of mentioned to you off air, and we touched on a little bit, when you did contact me and you sort of mentioned the name, it wasn't one of these ones where straight away I was like, who? Like, I know nothing about this. Like, you've heard the name in passing, obviously reading in a book like Total Olympics, but as we've talked about, kind of going into the further details, because just that stat alone, most Olympic medals in one day, like that.
Amazing. And insane. Only too shy of the Olympics for the medal haul for an entire single Olympiad. It is amazing. My single favorite thing that I found, I mentioned obviously restoring him to his proper place, and also just kind of the dignity of telling folks how this man died, the tragic way he died, but to know how a person died, I think is an important thing. But one thing that was really thrilling, I mentioned that sort of Denver Turner Association, and it is obviously not, it still is, it's now sort of like a Denver dance hall, a German dance hall in Denver, but it's no longer a gymnast place. But what was so exciting, on the basement of this club, we found a beautiful framed photo of the team that he was on from 1900, I believe it is. And so here, it's the first and the only really close-up photograph of him that exists. And I put it's on the story, and it's on my website, which is just my name, joshuaprager.com. And he's this sort of like regal looking guy. Everyone else, they look kind of a little puny and very young. And he is the only one on the team with a mustache. His arms are folded like his teammates, but he looks like he knows who he is. You know what I mean? He's the star. And in fact, after the Olympics, what's great, literally every single one of the photos of him and his teammates afterwards, he's standing in the middle. So the Olympics, I think, really kind of put him where he deserved to be in everyone's estimation.
I kind of just feel like he sadly was in the wrong time. Like if you think about him, if he had won 6 medals in a day at the Paris Olympics with a wooden leg, I mean, this guy would be bigger than Phelps, bigger than Biles, bigger than Bolt.
If he won 1 medal on a wooden leg, can you imagine that?
Well, you mentioned Oscar Pistorius. I mean, you remember sort of, obviously everything that's happened, but before all that, yes, when he was competing, in the Olympics, before the Paralympics, like how big of a deal that was at that time, and when Natalie did it obviously prior, so it was a big deal.
But if they actually medaled, it would be sort of remarkable. So yes, he would have been a very different. He would have been on the cover of our magazines and newspapers. So now he is. Here he is, the American Scholar. He's on the cover of one all these years later.
Exactly.
So it's a nice feeling.
If you were able to go back in time right now, Elon Musk, somebody like that was like, Joshua, we've got a time machine. You're going back. You're gonna go meet him. What would be the first thing that you said or asked him if he was in front of you right now?
Wow. I think the very first thing I would ask him is how he was injured. That's like me for 12 years. I would want to confirm that fact. But then I would really just want to understand who he was as a human being. Again, did he suffer from mental illness, as I imagine he did? Why did he never marry? Another thing that was so sort of, just upsetting is we don't even know, as I say, where the man is buried. Bought these plots for his aunt and his sister, but then he's sort of, we don't even know. We know generally where he is. Kind of put a little bit of humanity into the man instead of just sort of, connecting the dots of his actions and his behaviors. I was able to do it a little bit, but I wish I could do it more. And as a writer, that was the great challenge for me here. I'm used to being able to interview people. I'm used to being able to sort of, flesh out a scene more. And there were beautiful things that I found that enabled me to do it somewhat, but still he is a little bit of a ghost for me. And that's hard.
Is there scope? I mean, I don't want to actually, I'll rephrase that question. When they make a movie on him, because I mean, like seriously, just like the article, it screams movie. Like honestly, if there's any article I've read recently that screams movie, it's this, particularly in today's times when, we're celebrating, diversity and overcoming, obstacles and things like that. Who would you like to see play George? Have you thought about that? And how do we get this made into a movie, Joshua? Because it should be one. So
I will tell you, I would be lying if I say I didn't say that I hadn't had the thought that it would be great if it was optioned. The man really has a very sort of cinematic life. It's kind of crazy, the life that he lived. Who would play him? He's a handsome man. He's got those sort of hooded eyes and his little mustache and stuff. I don't know. I got to think about that. Who would be good? I got one for you. The guy, what is his name? Miles Teller, the guy who plays the Tom Cruise in Top Gun. That's the guy.
Yeah. No, actually, you're spot on there. I was trying to picture who I could see him being played, but no, I think Miles Teller would be fantastic. So
he'd be good. He's my choice.
Good cut. How does it work? Like, I mean, as a writer, like, do you ship it to Hollywood? Does Hollywood come to you? Is there a bit of both? Like, how do you get this turned into a movie?
So what ends up happening is I happen to have had many things, not many, like 5 or 6 of my articles over the last 20 years option, meaning we want to buy the rights to turn this into a television show or a movie. All but one of them, you get enough money to buy a very nice suit or a dinner or something. It's not life-changing. One of them, though, thank God Almighty, it actually bought my house. I wrote a book on Roe v. Wade, the famous lawsuit here in America that has sort of convulsed our country. And that took me 11 years. I think you see things take a long time for me. That was what I was working on while I was doing George on the side. And then luckily there were two companies that approached my agent and said, hey, we would really like to do this. And I talked to them. And that was exciting. And that is now at the point where it's been written and there is an actor chosen and a director. And right now they are pitching it to various, studios. So that's very exciting, but that very rarely happens with this. It would have to be someone who's listening to you right now. That's our, no pressure, but
Hollywood elite listen to this show, Joshua. I'm telling you now, we are connected. So
okay, well, then it'll just be a matter of time. I'll call you the moment it happens.
Please do, and when you get the Oscar, no doubt for writing original screenplay, anything along those lines, thank us in your speech. That's all we ask.
I absolutely will. I promise you. It's now on record.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Seriously, for anybody who has not checked this out, read it. It is such an absolutely fascinating story. It is so incredible to read. Joshua, tag your website. I know you mentioned it prior, but tag it again. Social media. Where can people read this? Where can people follow your journey as well with all the other great stuff that you got going on as well?
Well, that's very kind of you. I am a complete Luddite. I have a flip phone. I've never been on social media in my life. So
I'm jealous. I am very jealous.
The one thing I've got is a website. It's just my name, Joshua Prager, Prager.com, and then click on articles, and you'll see it right there. A picture of the handsome George that I mentioned with his mustache, and it's a moving story. And I just want to sort of finish by saying I was really honored to write it because I think that this man deserves to be known, and in fact, that's how the whole piece finishes. Someone. That sentence really bothered me. I'm bringing it up again, that someone sort of said in the Wall Street Journal that the writer said, well, because of George, it's evidence that the 1904 games are best forgotten. And I said, quite the opposite of true. Because of George, it's evidence that the 1904 games are best remembered. And so, I'm really thankful to you for giving me the opportunity to speak to your audience and tell a little bit about George.
Well, we're very thankful that you were able to tell the story in your great article, Joshua. So we thank you for your time, and I look forward to the Oscars. 2029? Let's say. Let's put a timeline.
Sounds like a plan. We'll sit together.